Previously on the Bearded Nerd.
This is big business, Roger.
Not anymore. I'm gonna burn it down.
You can't. It's too big, Roger. These people are trained, expert killers.
If you hold back anything, I'll kill you. If you bend the truth, or I think you're bending the truth, I'll kill you.
Who the f*** are you? Yeah!
If you forget anything, I'll kill you. In fact, you're gonna have to work very hard to stay alive, Nick. Now, do you understand everything I've said? Because if you don't, I'll kill you.
What's going on over there? I'll show you with the box. What's in the box? What's in the box?
Give me the gun. Just don't.
You lie! You're a liar! Shut up! No! Just throw it all away, you know. No!
Hey, is that a bazooka?
A rapid fire machine gun. It's a bazooka rather than a handgun.
That is a heat-seeking ground-to-air rocket launcher from CIA.
Look, the people you are after are the people you depend on. You cook your meals, you haul your trash, we connect your calls, we drive your ambulances. We guard you while you sleep. Do not us.
What the f*** are you doing here?
By this point in the Bearded Nerd series, I've covered numerous people, products, and events surrounding the earliest gaming consoles. I've covered the Magnavox Odyssey, Atari's Pong, the Atari 2600 and 5200, the Mattel Intellivision, the ColecoVision, Donkey Kong, Mystique, E.T., the video game crash of 1983, Tengen, the Game Genie, light gun technology, the Power Glove, the Nintendo PlayStation, the 3DO, and even the first video games ever created. Now, I'm moving on to another generation of consoles.
In the ashes of the video game crash of 1983, Nintendo was in a prime position to capitalize on a market that many at the time felt had already seen its best days. In 1983, Nintendo had only been known as a Japanese company that produced game cards and a handful of hit arcade games. Their biggest hit, Donkey Kong, had been ported over to several popular home gaming consoles at the time, but Nintendo hadn't yet released their own gaming console in North America. By 1983, Nintendo had already released their Famicom console in their home country of Japan, but failed negotiations with Atari to produce a home gaming console for the North American market had fallen through. Atari was owned by Warner Communications at the time. After a lackluster holiday season in 1982 and an unimpressive first half of 1983, CEO Ricoh was shown the door in July of '83, making any potential deals Atari was trying to make get shoved to the back burner of Warner's list of priorities. Had this deal actually gone through though, which according to Howard Lincoln was in the final stages, it would have dramatically changed the gaming industry to a possibly unrecognizable landscape today. Lincoln has said of the failed agreement with Atari, quote,
I mean, it was a done deal. We spent a week putting this thing together, this elaborate agreement in Kyoto. Skip Paul was over there. We had the whole thing put together. It was a deal.
At this time in 1983, Nintendo and Coleco were both battling movie studio Universal over copyright infringement involving their respective releases of Donkey Kong. Nintendo had entered into an agreement with Coleco to release Donkey Kong to the North American home market on the ColecoVision. Universal claimed Donkey Kong was an obvious ripoff to the title character King Kong, which they claimed to have owned the rights to. In January of 1984, while arguing their case in front of the United States Supreme Court, Universal discovered that they did not even technically own the rights to King Kong. At one point they had, but somewhere along the way they had let the copyright lapse without renewing it. And what Universal must have felt was a sucker punch to the face. While actively making arguments before the Supreme Court, Nintendo took full advantage of Universal's slip-up and came out victorious in the court system. Coleco, who had also been named in the suit, had already made a deal with Universal by paying royalties to any Donkey Kong cartridges sold under the Coleco name. Coleco then successfully sued Universal, getting back royalties that Universal was not even legally entitled to.
In fact, I'll make a deal with you. We will drop this case right now if you come over here and put your testicles right here and let me slam this door like this! Go ahead. We can settle this right now. Call it even. I will drop this case right now if you let me slam your balls in this door, because that's what happened to my client!
At the 1983 Chicago Consumer Electronics Show in June, before the outcome of that lawsuit would be known, Nintendo and Coleco had taken on the role of close, but not yet fully trusted allies battling the media giant Universal. Not to mention, pulling an offensive against the gaming and toy giants Atari and Mattel respectfully.
Well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants. I got news for you, pal. You ain't leading but two things right now. Jack and Jack left town.
At that Consumer Electronics Show, Nintendo's Hiroshi Yamauchi, Minoru Arakawa, and Howard Lincoln were greeted with a furious Ray Kazar, demanding to know why Coleco had been granted permission to port a version of Donkey Kong over to the Atom computer, as was evidenced by their highly talked about display at CES. Kazar claimed this had violated Nintendo's agreement with Atari for home computer rights to the game. Nintendo, while having granted Coleco exclusive rights to porting Donkey Kong over to home gaming consoles and tabletop versions, had preserved home computer rights of Donkey Kong to Atari. In Coleco's mind, their Atom computer was more of a gaming console. Its intention was to compete against the Commodore 64, which was a home computer that played video games. The concept of the Atom was to take a gaming console and turn it into a home computer, going so far as requiring users to connect them to their television sets, as opposed to a custom-built monitor.
Is that legal?
Command the powers of Atom and program your future.
Whether Coleco genuinely believed the Atom computer was covered under home gaming consoles is unclear, but I suspect they didn't. But if you already have rights to the most popular game of the time, why not gamble in that gray area and use it to promote your new machine at the most popular trade show of the year? With negotiations between Nintendo and an angry Atari put on hold, Nintendo made sure to remind Coleco of not only their place in regards to the Donkey Kong rights, but also of how submissive Coleco had actually behaved in regards to the Universal lawsuit.
You know your shoelace is untied.
Nintendo's General Counsel Howard Lincoln called a meeting with Coleco President Arnold Greenberg to discuss a few items. The meeting had kept a civil tone until Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi burst in abruptly and began screaming in Japanese while pointing at Greenberg. It's reported that Hiroshi was demanding that Coleco cease Donkey Kong production and public showcases of Donkey Kong on the Atom computer. Coleco complied and Atari agreed to continue negotiations with Nintendo, but Atari was starting to feel the effects of the video game crash of 1983. By July, Warner CEO Ray Kazar resigned amid allegations of insider trading. The Security and Exchange Commission charged Kazar with selling 5,000 shares of Warner stock in a December 8, 1982 trade. Kazar sold his stock at 11:41 a.m. Pacific Time, and 23 minutes later at 12:04 p.m., Warner issued a press release announcing that its 1982 sales were substantially below expectations. Not long after the press release, Warner stock plummeted from $52 a share down to just $36.25 a share. By Christmas Eve, the stock had fallen to $29.50 a share, and the SEC began investigating Kazar and another Warner executive for possible insider trading. Even if those allegations had never surfaced, the Warner board was already uneasy with Kazar's leadership following a lackluster business year. Following Kazar's departure, those left to run Warner and Atari were more interested in easing the effects of the video game crash that were already taking a toll on not just them, but on their domestic competitors Mattel and Coleco as well. Looking at where Atari, Mattel, and Coleco were in 1983, with the hindsight of being over 35 years in the future, it's easy to feel like Bruce Willis in 12 Monkeys, essentially saying, there's just nothing you guys can do to prevent this from happening, it's just going to happen.
Are you going to save us, Mr. Cole?
How can I save you? This already happened. I can't save you, nobody can.
Atari abandoning the deal didn't face Nintendo at all. Instead, they focused on just releasing the Famicom to North America themselves. But there was one slight problem. Actually, there were several problems. First off, by 1983, video games were considered a fad that was quickly fading fast. Even the superior arcades couldn't keep people pumping quarters into them. Secondly, the United States was just beginning to get out of a brief economic recession that had begun in July of 1981 and only ended in November of 1982. By then, unemployment in the US had hit 10.8%, the highest since the Great Depression. Attempting to release a product like the Famicom in a market like that was extremely risky. American consumers didn't have jobs, let alone money. Another obstacle for Nintendo was, despite having made a name for themselves with the release of Donkey Kong, they would be competing against the already established players of Atari, Mattel, and Coleco. The latter they had partnered up with to release Donkey Kong to home consumers. It was a partnership Nintendo took full advantage of by demanding insanely high royalties and upfront payments from their partner Coleco. Not to mention that by late 1983, Nintendo was still fighting Universal in the courts over the similarities between King Kong and Donkey Kong. Nintendo had entered into the American business conscience as a foreign, untrustworthy, arrogant bully. For the average Japanese investor, the conditions for Nintendo releasing their own console to a North American market were not favorable at all. But the Japanese were not ones to back down from a challenge. Don't believe me? Just check out my prior episode on Betamax. While Nintendo's Famicom system had already been released to the Japanese market, Western consumers weren't familiar with it at all. It wasn't like it is today. Remember kids, the internet in 1983 consisted of this. Hopefully Nora has changed their password since then.
So the combination is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the stupidest combination I ever heard in my life! That's the kind of thing an idiot would have on his luggage!
But what was the Famicom anyway? It was the first of the third generation of gaming consoles. The Magnavox Odyssey was the first generation. Atari's Pong isn't technically put into this group of first generation consoles. Remember, Pong wasn't built in the same manner as the Odyssey. Pong performed its functions because it's 66 discrete logic chips and no operating system. The Odyssey 2, the Fairchild Channel F, the RCA Studio 2, the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the Mattel Intellivision, and the ColecoVision are all considered to be the second generation. The Famicom is the first of what are technically 4 third-generation consoles, but the two important ones, the only two Japan ever saw, were both released on July 15, 1983. That other important third-generation console released was the Sega SG-1000. Look, I know, Americans have never heard of this thing. Americans are much more familiar with the Atari 7800 and XE game system, both of which have been largely forgotten about and honestly are just embarrassing reminders of the mistakes Atari made during this time. At a time when Atari was burying all their surplus in a New Mexico desert like something out of a Vince Gilligan series, the next generation of gaming consoles was just getting started across the Pacific. Spoiler alert, Jesse kills Mike after Saul ran Walter over with his Winnebago. Sega was actually founded as the American company Standard Games in 1940. In their early years, they mainly provided coin-operated amusement machines on American military bases. Throughout the 1940s and going all the way through the 1970s, this company went through countless mergers, acquisitions, divisions, and pretty much anything a company can legally and physically do until it became unrecognizable from its original form. The name Sega was an abbreviation of service games first used in 1954 slot machines. Service Games was one of the names the original company was known as at the time. By 1969, the company that resembled the Bride of Chucky was ultimately sold to Gulf and Western Industries. I'd have a better chance explaining a David Lynch movie to you than explaining the mess of Sega's ownership history. But what Sega did throughout the 1970s and 80s is a bit easier to explain. Sega was one of several companies that took advantage of the video arcade boom, starting with Atari's Pong in late 1972. Just prior to this video arcade boom, Sega actually had produced an electromechanical submarine simulator game called Periscope. Periscope was quite successful in Japan, Europe, and even the United States. Sega continued producing and manufacturing games like this throughout the 1970s. The video game crash of 1983 had a major negative effect on Sega, and they ultimately sold its North American manufacturing and licensing rights to Bally. After the sale of Bally, Sega still maintained a North American presence with the research and development department, but Gulf and Western wanted Sega to focus on the home console market in Japan. Over at Nintendo in October of 1981, a young engineer named Masayuki Uemura was left with the daunting task of designing Nintendo's next home console. Uemura was a logical choice because he had had a major hand with Nintendo's line of early home consoles, most notably the color TV games 6 and 15. But these early consoles didn't utilize interchangeable cartridges. Uemura also had a hand in creating their highly successful line of Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Games. Despite the importance Hiroshi Yamauchi was emphasizing on this Famicom project, Uemura was only given 3 other people to assemble his team. Other projects at Nintendo at this time typically had dozens of people working on them. Despite feeling like the Famicom was a doomed project from day one, Uemura got started by examining both the Atari 2600 and the ColecoVision, because even Atari's competitor Coleco had managed to replicate arcade-style graphics for the home market. Uemura was also tasked with keeping the cost as low as possible. The main goal was to make it cheap enough to retail at 10,000 yen. From the beginning, Nintendo wanted to cater to children with their home console. To do that, they wanted the Famicom to be both inexpensive and easy to use. To cater to an older crowd, they wanted to wow them with not just familiar arcade titles to play at home, but to take a step even further than what Coleco was doing with the Atom computer. Nintendo was already working with Coleco to bring Donkey Kong to American homes, and they knew the ColecoVision had superior hardware compared to competitors Atari or Mattel. Nintendo wanted to take a page from Coleco's playbook and offer a home console that was not just equivalent in quality to arcade games, but better than those arcade games. To achieve this, they needed superior hardware themselves. Nintendo approached an Osaka-based semiconductor company called Ricoh. Ricoh engineer Masahiro Shindo was Nintendo's initial contact with the company. Nintendo pitched Shindo with their idea of the Famicom and how they wanted to incorporate Ricoh into the technical aspects of the project. Shindo liked where they were going, but upon sharing this plan with his fellow Ricoh engineers, the company gave a, less than enthusiastic response. The negative response had nothing to do with working with Nintendo. It had to do with what they say was a laughable circuit board design for the Famicom. Ricoh and their engineers had their own ideas for how to produce a circuit board that achieved what Nintendo was trying to do. Shindo returned to Nintendo with this new board design. Ricoh wanted to take an arcade circuit board and remove the CPU, the LSIs, and all the memory. They instead wanted to use a 6502 8-bit CPU as the heart of the console. The reason Ricoh wanted to use the 6502 was because they already had acquired a license to use it. The alternative that all of Nintendo's competitors used, including Nintendo themselves even, was the Z80. While it was a more expensive and larger chipset to use, the quality of the Z80 surpassed the 6502. Not to mention that if Nintendo was going to port their own titles over to the Famicom, and the Famicom used the 6502, converting them via the source code would be literally impossible. The Z80 and 6502 were not compatible in any way. Ironically, it was this incompatibility that actually caused Uemura to originally lean towards using the 6502 in the Famicom. When these decisions were being made in late 1982 and early 1983, the video game crash had already begun to take shape. One of the numerous causes for the crash had to do with the saturation of copycat games in the market. Nintendo could clearly see the American market was filled with unauthorized copies of every game imaginable, and they wanted to prevent this from ever happening with the Famicom. By using the 6502 processor instead of the more popular Z80, copying games from the Famicom would be much more difficult. Most Japanese programmers were not even familiar with the 6502 enough to easily program games for it, and it was this exact problem that caused many of Nintendo's own engineers to object to using the 6502. But an executive decision needed to be made, and from a financial standpoint, using the cheaper, smaller, already licensed CPU made much more business sense. Ricoh was also in the unique position to fulfill Nintendo's demand for manufacturing. This was because, unlike their own competitors, Ricoh was only pushing out microprocessors at 10% capacity at their factory. This meant Nintendo could acquire all the CPUs from one single location, instead of multiple locations, not to mention get them a lot cheaper. When it comes to manufacturing, companies ordering huge, bulk orders of things, like microprocessors, are typically given a bulk rate based on ordering a minimum number of units. When it came to a bulk rate for CPUs, in order to get the best deal, Nintendo needed to order not 10,000 or even 100,000, but instead over 1 million microprocessors. 3 million to be exact. This meant Nintendo was counting on not just producing 3 million Famicom systems, but on selling them as well. In comparison, it took Atari 3 years just to sell 3,2600,000 consoles. And don't forget that while America's population in 1983 was around 225 million, Japan had considerably fewer people with a population of only about 120 million. Proportionately, Nintendo was basically relying on selling twice as many consoles as Atari had during the 3-year period. The Famicom project was becoming a huge gamble for Nintendo. By April of 1983, Uemura had reached a breaking point with the hand his team had been dealt. Programming for the unfamiliar 6502 microprocessor proved too much for a small team, and it was then that they hired a young engineer, Shuhei Kato, who specialized in programming the 6502. Kato was dubbed by the Famicom team as the living 6502 manual. It wasn't just that most Japanese programmers were not trained at programming games for the 6502. It was also that the tools required were just not available to Japanese programmers. The company that had developed these tools was American, and that made acquiring the necessary tools much more difficult. To program their games prior to Kato's hiring, the Famicom team used emulators. Eventually, Nintendo developed their own custom programming tool that they dubbed NCAP. Creating a unique design for the Famicom casing was also important. Nintendo wanted the Famicom to stand out, but not to a degree that consumers would turn away from this particular looking machine. In the end, the Famicom came out of production looking like, nothing really that exciting. It's not ugly, but it's also really not that special either. Masayuki Yukiyawa described it as nothing more than a boring box. But the inside was what was going to count anyway. One cost-cutting detail that does make it unique was that both controllers were permanently attached to the console. The controllers themselves were also very different from the standard joystick controllers of the time. The Famicom controllers utilized a D-pad that acted as the means by which a user would move objects or characters on screen. Originally, a microphone had been planned to be placed on one of the controllers. This was intended for any karaoke programs written for it. Hey, if you think karaoke was big in the United States, in Japan, it's practically a religion. But the microphone was scrapped due to cost. A 15-pin expansion port intended to connect any peripherals was also included on the front. This expansion port was not uncommon for computers at the time, and really illustrated the computer part of Family Computer. The games and programs themselves would be accessed through ROM cartridges. There was an early concern that whatever technology they used to connect the cartridges and output the CPU would fail in too many units, as was the case for many of their own arcade cabinets. Nintendo ultimately went with a proprietary 60-pin connector to output the CPU, the image processor address, and the data bus. To test the durability of this proprietary technology, the development team personally performed experiments, such as inserting and reinserting a cartridge over 5,000 times. A lot of money was being invested in a system with an unfamiliar CPU to programmers, an unfamiliar market for home gaming consoles, and at a time when the gaming industry in North America was crashing like a meteor. Even Famicom project leader Masayuki Uemura showed little confidence in its ultimate success. Hiroshi Yamauchi was going all in with the Famicom. One of the main goals for Nintendo was to obviously keep the sale price as low as possible. From a business perspective, Nintendo defended selling the Famicom nearly at cost on the expectation that consumers would spend more on the various game cartridges released, which is where the profit would ultimately come from. Yamauchi requested that the Famicom cost no more than 9,800 yen to manufacture. The initial sale price would be 14,800 yen. In June of 1983, Nintendo invited Japanese retailers to a demonstration of the new Famicom system. Overall reaction was good, and actually got even better after Nintendo confirmed the retail price would be 14,800 yen. This was considerably cheaper than many retailers had predicted. This was also around the same time as the CES incident in Chicago. Because the Famicom team was under the impression Atari would be brought in as a distribution partner, the Famicom's instruction manual was left completely unwritten at this point. After the Atari deal fell through, Yamato and Kato were tasked with writing the manual, in only one night. The Famicom was finally completed and released on July 15, 1983, at the height of the video game crash. Despite the timing, Nintendo and retailers were both satisfied and confident with this new home gaming console. But that same July 15th would also see the release of a competing home gaming console, the Sega SG-1000. In terms of the video game industry, Sega is like the cool uncle who travels the world, never settles down, and has a bunch of illegitimate kids. Always the bridesmaid, but never even wants to be the bride.
Everybody, this is my son. Cool. Did he say cool? Cool.
However, Sega didn't necessarily want to be the cool uncle forever, because when it comes time for a new king to be named, it's never the cool uncle. Sega has spent the 1970s and early 80s competing with Nintendo in the coin-operated arcade market, and both made respectable titles. And in 1982, the worst-kept secret in the industry was that Nintendo was going to enter the home gaming market themselves. At the time, many analysts thought video games in general were just a fad on its way out the door. Anyone wanting to gamble on this market was destined to lose. Nintendo took this skepticism as an opportunity to dominate the market free of any real competition. But Sega also held those same beliefs as well. While Nintendo was developing a home console powered by microprocessors that were not only unfamiliar to Japanese programmers and incompatible with any of their arcade titles, Sega decided to play it safe. Perhaps a little too safe. The SG-1000 resembled the ColecoVision much more than it resembled the Famicom, and no disrespect to the ColecoVision. Compared to other second-generation consoles, the ColecoVision was superior in hardware and software. Games ported over to the ColecoVision much more resembled their arcade counterparts, in terms of graphics quality and overall gameplay, than the versions available on either the Atari 2600 or the Intellivision. But the Famicom was designed to display even better graphics, so for Sega to use basically the same hardware as the ColecoVision would prove almost fatal for them. There was nothing original or new about the SG-1000. Even the controller was a typical joystick, while Nintendo had already moved on to a D-pad type controller. After both consoles were released on the same day in 1983, Nintendo thought they were going to have a lock on the Japanese home market. And for a few months, it certainly appeared that way, until a flaw was discovered in the Famicom, a near fatal flaw that almost ended Nintendo's efforts after they had just started to dominate the market. Not long after the Famicom's initial release, reports started to surface about units either freezing or crashing completely during gameplay. Nintendo eventually traced the problem to a faulty circuit in the motherboard and made the risky decision to recall all Famicom consoles in an effort to correct the problem. Sega saw this as an opportunity to capitalize on the Japanese market with no competitor. If there was ever a moment where Nintendo was weakest, it was now. Unfortunately for Sega, the SG-1000 was essentially just a ColecoVision clone going up against the even more powerful Famicom. During the Famicom recall in late 1983, Sega did attempt to dominate the market and ended up exceeding their own 50,000 unit sales goal by selling 160,000 units at 15,000 yen apiece. Plus, Sega had 21 games available versus only 9 games for the Famicom at this time. Despite this setback, Nintendo was not yet ready to throw in the towel. If anything, they began making plans to expand into the North American market. Yes, I said that right. By the end of 1983, Nintendo, who had initiated a complete recall of their just-released Famicom system and were now trailing Sega in the Japanese home console market, doubled down on the Famicom by making plans to release a version to North America. Plus, they were already looking at how to improve the Famicom by developing add-ons for it. But before any of those plans could take flight, Nintendo needed to fix the faulty circuit boards in their recalled Famicom systems. By year's end of 1983, Sega had exceeded all expectations and were becoming the standard home gaming console in Japan. But Sega had released a technologically inferior SG-1000 gaming console, and with Nintendo's recall, had zero competition. Their time in the spotlight was destined to be limited, at least for now. By early 1984, Nintendo had fixed their circuit board issue and not only replaced all the previously purchased Famicom systems, but began selling even more than ever before. Within a year, Nintendo had sold 2.5 million Famicom consoles in Japan. They had gambled with Ricoh in their deal for ordering 3 million microprocessors. They had gambled with a new controller that utilized the now standard D-pad. They had gambled by recalling and fixing their faulty circuit boards, instead of just ignoring consumers' complaints. And their gamble was paying off. Despite having successfully gambled and won in the Japanese market, North America was a vastly different beast. After the video game crash of 1983, the gaming market in general was a post-apocalyptic landscape that looked bleak. Analysts believed that video games were just simply a fad that had gone the way of the pet rock and disco. To get the ball rolling in North America, Hiroshi Yamauchi had to rely on his already established arm on the continent. By that point, Howard Lincoln had already proven himself an indispensable player in the company. By 1985, Lincoln was already serving as Nintendo's senior vice president and general counsel. But the man whom Yamauchi tasked with running the North American side of his company was Minoru Arakawa. Arakawa had been born to a Kyoto family on September 3, 1946, exactly 1 year and 1 day to Japan officially surrendering in World War II. After getting an education at Kyoto University, which included a master's degree in engineering, Arakawa enrolled at MIT in Boston in 1971, where he earned his second master's degree. After returning to his native country in 1972, Arakawa began working for the Tokyo-based company Marubeni, where he helped design office buildings and hotels. While attending a Christmas party that year in Kyoto, Arakawa met a young woman named Yoko Yamauchi. Arakawa eventually discovered that the young Miss Yamauchi was the daughter of a prominent businessman in Kyoto. Even though her father, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was the president of a respected card-making company there in Kyoto and had a reputation of being a cutthroat businessman, Arakawa was not intimidated by Yoko's father. Minoru and Yoko were head over heels for each other, and less than a year later, got married. In 1977, Arakawa moved the family to Vancouver for an employment opportunity building condominiums. 3 years later, Hiroshi Yamauchi approached his son-in-law with a business proposal. Hiroshi was interested in establishing a North American presence for his company, which at the time was still relatively unknown in the West. But Hiroshi knew his company was developing a new product, a coin-operated arcade cabinet featuring a new title called Donkey Kong. Hiroshi wanted Arakawa to establish and run the North American extension of Nintendo. Yoko completely opposed her husband, taking her father up on the offer. The very idea brought back memories for Yoko of growing up with her father, and her memories did not resemble Ozzy and Harriet. Hiroshi Yamauchi had spent much of his life raised by his grandparents. During his childhood, Hiroshi's grandfather, Sekiro Kaneda, was president of the Nintendo company. Although Hiroshi's family connection to the company was through his mother, who was the granddaughter of the company's founder. Before he even turned 6 years old in 1933, Hiroshi's father had abandoned both him and his mother. Soon after, his mother also abandoned him, leaving young Hiroshi with her parents. By his teenage years, Hiroshi had become a stereotypical rebellious teenager. When World War II came around, he was too young to serve in combat, but he wasn't too young, however, to work in a military factory. After the war ended, Hiroshi began studying law. In 1949, Hiroshi's grandfather suffered a stroke.
Kaneda had very much dreamed of leaving the company in the hands of his son-in-law, but by this time, he had been absent from the family for more than a decade and a half. The dying Kaneda had actually been the son-in-law of Nintendo's founder when he took over the company.
So this idea of passing the torch on to the son-in-law was nothing new, nor would it turn old in the coming decades either.
On his deathbed, Kaneda asked for Hiroshi to assume the role as president of his family's company. He was only 21 years old. Hiroshi agreed, but had one condition he wanted Kaneda to sign off on.
Hiroshi wanted to eliminate any other family members from working at Nintendo. This meant firing anyone sharing the family bloodline, including Hiroshi's cousin.
The dying Kaneda agreed to Hiroshi's condition. Shortly after, Sekiro Kaneda passed away, and the 21-year-old Hiroshi Yamauchi proceeded to assume his new role.
This included not only the dirty work of firing his cousin, but also of terminating the employment of both longtime workers as well as every single manager, whom he personally fired, one by one.
Hiroshi feared leaving the old guard in place would only lead to an atmosphere where his authority would constantly be questioned. On the home front, Hiroshi Yamauchi and his young wife, with whom he had been married to in a traditional arranged marriage by his grandfather, welcomed a daughter into their lives in 1950. Yoko Yamauchi would be the oldest of 3 children for their young family. Before her younger brother and sister were born, Yoko's mother experienced several miscarriages. Yoko's memories of her childhood included always feeling scared around her father, whom she felt was often absent from home, and when he wasn't, was constantly angry. Hiroshi spent Yoko's childhood consumed by his work, something Yoko soon resented. So, when Yoko's father offered her husband an opportunity to be part of Nintendo's expansion in 1980, she quickly and loudly objected. Despite his wife's objections, Arakawa accepted his father-in-law's offer. Arakawa moved his family from Vancouver to Manhattan and proceeded to set up an office for Nintendo of America. I discussed in my Betamax episode about how Sony didn't understand American culture enough to make Betamax successful in the United States. To JVC's credit, they did understand it and used the opportunity to successfully push VHS to American consumers. To Nintendo's credit, they understood it too. They realized 2 things Americans loved were guns and robots. And if a robot had a gun, even better.
Come quietly or there will be trouble.
You! If Nintendo was going to make a dent in this post-apocalyptic video game landscape, they needed to come out guns blazing. Literally. Throughout 1984, Nintendo began designing and developing a Famicom system that would appeal to American consumers. The use of light gun technology was still relatively new in reference to video games. Arcade games were known to use positional guns, which determine where the gun is pointed because it's hard mounted to the cabinet. I'm not going to get into too much detail about how light guns work because I already did a prior episode on that. But the basic concept involves the television screen transmitting a brief black frame after the trigger is pulled, followed by a brief black frame with all the targets replaced by white squares. If the light gun is pointed at a white square, it knows this and sends a command to the game, telling the game that the user hit the target. Nintendo would eventually call their light gun the Zapper. It was initially produced with a gray and white body, but after its popularity grew, they changed it to a red and white body. Another addition that Nintendo speculated would be successful was a robot companion that would play certain games with the user. R.O.B, the robotic operating buddy, would work with similar technology to the light gun. When the user pressed a specific button, the screen would flash, triggering R.O.B to begin certain pre-programmed moves. There would be only 2 games released that were designed for R.O.B, Gyromite and Stack Up. While Nintendo had gained significant confidence after successfully gambling on the Famicom, they were still up against numerous obstacles if they were going to release it in North America. Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi had been a keen observer with how the video game market had risen and fallen in North America. He took away several key mistakes that Atari, Mattel, and Coleco all made that caused the video game industry to crash. The first mistake was control, or the lack thereof. None of them had any control over third parties or competitors releasing games for their respective consoles. Nintendo would rectify this with the use of a lockout chip installed in the console itself. The lockout chip worked by physically preventing any game cartridges that didn't contain a key from loading the program into the console. The idea behind the lockout chip was to control the Nintendo game library from third-party developers. Anyone wanting to release a game cartridge would have to go through Nintendo itself in order to do so. As a result of this practice, Nintendo would guarantee no game would be released without their quality seal of approval. The quality control process was also supposed to root out any pornographic games from being released, which had also been an issue for the Atari 2600. Nintendo had good intentions with the lockout chip, but you know what they say about good intentions. Policies Nintendo enacted that painted them as totalitarian in the eyes of both consumers and developers included restricting any third party to a cap of only releasing 5 different titles per year, requiring third-party developers to manufacture so many copies, and requiring large licensing fees just for the privilege of even doing business with them.
You work for me now. You have you give it to me. That's your job. And what I want is half your and if that's too much, you can make, find, or steal more, and it'll even out sooner or later. This is your way of life now. The more you fight back, the harder it will be. So if someone knocks on your door, you let us in. We own that door. You try to stop us, and we will knock it down.
It's no surprise that third-party developers started revolting. Some even took to extreme measures to do so. But that story I already covered in detail before as well. In Nintendo's defense, they were trying to prevent another video game crash because an oversaturation of similar and poorly made games was one of the causes of the crash. However, they probably went a little too far with their strict licensing rules. Having a quality control process is great, and even taking a fair amount of the profits from third-party developers is okay too, but limiting third-party developers to only 5 titles per year was probably Nintendo overreaching their authority. And I'm not the only one who thought this either. In a lawsuit against Nintendo, the courts ruled Nintendo had violated laws aimed at preventing monopolies in any given industry. When it came to design, Nintendo wanted to make American consumers comfortable with using a Famicom system. From a technical sense, it's more practical to design a console that reads games from a top loader. But Nintendo thought designing a console that read game cartridges through a front loader would make more American consumers feel like they were operating an already successful product, the VCR. With that in mind, game cartridges were designed larger than their Famicom counterparts, in an effort to make the cartridge feel more like a videotape. Because these cartridges were physically larger, they were designed to house 72 pins, as opposed to the 60 pins used in Famicom cartridges. The officially released cartridges mostly all looked like this. The only games officially released to the public that looked different were the first 2 Legend of Zelda games. Those were encased in a gold-colored cartridge. Third-party developers who successfully bypassed Nintendo's lockout chip would use several different cartridge designs as well. There are a couple more exceptions in regards to officially licensed games, but those exceptions were typically not major releases. They were limited releases that were not even available to the public for sale. The Nintendo World Championship cartridges were limited to a total number of only 25 units ever produced, which were all given away as a contest prize in Nintendo Power in 1990. Another example would be the 2013 release of DuckTales Remastered. Capcom distributed 150 gold cartridges that featured the original DuckTales game to various news agencies as part of a press kit. To debut the Famicom in North America, Nintendo returned to their old stomping grounds at the Consumer Electronics Show. At the Las Vegas CES in January of 1985, Nintendo presented to retailers what they called their Advanced Video System. It was initially pushed as a full home computer, complete with a keyboard, a cassette data recorder, a not uncommon computer accessory in the 1980s, and a basic interpreter software cartridge. Their intention was not to market their new product as a gaming console, but rather as a home computer. It wasn't an unwise move either. If anything, it was probably a great move. However, retailers were still skeptical of their intentions, and Nintendo wasn't able to convince any retailers to even place a single order. The winter CES was a total flop, but instead of walking away from that experience with all hope lost, Hiroshi Yamauchi tasked his company to go back to the drawing board for the North American market. A March 1985 article in Electronic Games magazine questioned Nintendo's reasoning for pushing a gaming console to a market like North America, a market that the article's author reminded both its readers and Nintendo had virtually disappeared. It seemed as if the more people questioned Nintendo's decision to reach North American consumers, the more it motivated them to succeed there. Nintendo spent the first half of 1985 rethinking their approach to North America. As the summer CES approached and word got out that Nintendo would be pushing a new gaming system there at Chicago, eyes rolled again and even a little teasing was present as they set up their display at CES. But Nintendo just fed off of all of it. This time, however, an even different approach was taken at CES. To complement the NES prototype, the little robot I mentioned a few moments ago that Nintendo called R.O.B made his debut there. This 9.5-inch toy robot was Nintendo's way of diverting attention away from labeling the NES as a gaming console or even a toy, and instead as an entertainment system. And somehow, the ruse worked. One thing that needs to be discussed is exactly why Nintendo is adamant about not labeling the Famicom as either a gaming console or a toy. Now, the gaming console label obviously reminded retailers and consumers of the failed video game market, but the toy label was strictly avoided after Nintendo made a tactical error in one of their deals with toy retailers. In 1983, Nintendo of America began making deals with toy stores to stock the new Game & Watch product. Despite the eagle eyes of Nintendo's lawyers, such as Howard Lincoln, there was a traditional way that toy stores manage the financial part with manufacturers. The way it works is like this. A toy store orders a new, not yet released product in the beginning of the year, such as in January or February. By summer, the new inventory arrives at their warehouses. By September, the holiday season begins. Toy retailers typically expect all invoices for manufacturers to be dated December 10th or later, after the majority of the holiday season is over. At this point, toy stores begin actually paying the manufacturers for the already sold merchandise. After December 10th, toy stores will typically mark down the price for products that weren't selling that year. The markdown price actually gets sent back up to the manufacturer. In mid-December of 1983, Howard Lincoln received a call from a toy chain asking for the markdown money. Lincoln thought the toy chain was out of their mind and they were going to pass on the reduced price back to Nintendo. Lincoln told the toy chain that Nintendo had already sold them the product and had already sent them an invoice for it. If the toy store didn't sell it, that's not Nintendo's fault.
We shipped them to you, so you owe us the money. You took the risk. You owe us the money.
The toy chain tried to explain that if their product doesn't sell, the manufacturer is obligated to give the toy store the markdown money. Reducing the price is the only way to maintain their margin. Lincoln's response was, quote,
"You gotta be nuts."
But to maintain a good relationship with toy chains, Nintendo ultimately gave them the markdown price. They also learned a very big lesson about selling products in the toy industry. After the 1985 summer CES, retailers from both department stores and toy stores wanted to stock this new Nintendo Entertainment System on their shelves for the upcoming holiday season. Nintendo was happy to oblige retailers, but they refused to refer to the Famicom as either a video game console or a toy. It was the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Nintendo made it very clear that retailers were prohibited from marking it down in any situation. That final condition made retailers very nervous. But unknown to Hiroshi Yamauchi, Minoru Arakawa made a deal with retailers that eased their concerns about being left with unsold merchandise. To test the waters of the American market, Nintendo decided to focus all their efforts on a single major city by shipping 100,000 units to 500 retailers in the New York City market. And while retailers were interested in this new Nintendo Entertainment System, because they were prohibited from marking down the sale price in any circumstance, Minoru Arakawa had to offer a handful of risk-free incentives. These incentives included allowing Nintendo to handle all the marketing, the in-store setups, and all the demos. They also gave retailers a 90-day window to either sell the merchandise, which Nintendo gave to them under a good faith of credit, or to simply return the unsold units after the 90-day trial period was over. But they couldn't mark down the sale price, ever. The sale price for the basic console, with no game or accessories, was $89.99. Adjusted for inflation in 2019, that's just a little over $200. The same set with the pack-in game Super Mario Bros. Would run you $99.99, or about $230 in 2019. A total of 18 game packs, which Nintendo referred to as the launch titles, would also be available to consumers. Their light gun, the Zapper, was also available as well, and even that little 9.5-inch robot R.O.B would be available, but only with 2 games compatible for it. I'm going to save R.O.B for the topic of a standalone episode later. To get this new entertainment system to retailers, Minoru Arakawa needed help, so he began recruiting some. Hiroshi Yamauchi had just recently hired Bruce Lowry as Vice President of Sales. Lowry had been persuaded to leave Pioneer after Yamauchi tempted Lowry with the challenge of making the Famicom launch successful in North America. Lowry could see the success Nintendo had had with the Famicom in Japan. By that time, Nintendo had sold 2.5 million Famicom units there. Plus, Lowry's own kids loved the prototype they had sent him. Lowry accepted Yamauchi's challenge of making the Famicom successful in North America. Yamauchi and Lowry agreed on most strategic aspects of the North American launch. They agreed on the marketing, the time frame, and even of test marketing it in a single city, but the type of city neither could agree on. Lowry felt that a big, but not major city was their best approach. Nashville and Houston were on Lowry's list of low-risk, high-gain markets. If Famicom failed there, it wouldn't damage Nintendo's reputation when they eventually released future products. But Hiroshi Yamauchi had much more faith in the North American market and chose New York as the test market. On the morning of October 18, 1985, Hiroshi Yamauchi woke up confident that he had set his company up for success with taking the torch for the video game market in North America. He had tasked his son-in-law Minoru Arakawa with managing the details as the president of Nintendo of America. Yamauchi had complete confidence in Arakawa's abilities. But Arakawa was not a businessman by trade. He was an engineer. And like an engineer, he approached business by thinking outside the box. The incentives Arakawa promised retailers, such as distributing merchandise as credit instead of actually purchasing it, had been given while keeping Hiroshi Yamauchi completely in the dark. Okay, here's something I have to bring up and discuss, and I can guarantee it will create a controversy amongst gaming historians. And at the very least, this will just be thrown at the pile of proof that the Mandela effect is real. But it's more than worthy of a friendly discussion amongst those fellow gaming historians. And that is the release date of Super Mario Bros. Many think of it as one of the original launch titles, but was it really? I mean, can you tell me the date it was released on? If you type Super Mario Bros. Into Google, you'll get recommended the Wikipedia article. I know it's Wikipedia, but bear with me for a second. That article claims the Famicom version was released in Japan on September 13, 1985, but the North American date is unknown. Okay, like any source of information I use in my research, I have to double check the cited reference for all of this. Alright, so the cited reference is this article from Frank Cifaldi, and a link is even provided. Awesome! His article, though, comes full circle on his release date by explaining how he looked at Wikipedia, which is not even a good source to begin with. The big question that causes this uncertainty in Super Mario's release date is whether it was actually an October 1985 launch title. On paper, it was listed as a launch title, but whether it was actually on shelves with other launch titles is highly contested. Most agree the actual launch date was in October, but the actual date itself is still being debated. An October 5th, 1985 article in the Milwaukee Journal from writer Ed Simrad makes mention of a release date of next Tuesday. October 5th, 1985, the date this article was published, fell on a Saturday. That next Tuesday would have been the 8th, but if next Tuesday meant the Tuesday after that, then it would have been the 15th. The same article also lists the titles of all the launch games that would be available, and right there, Super Mario Bros. Was mentioned as being one of the 5 action games released immediately for the system. Now, is it possible this information published was not accurate? Of course. Nintendo's presence in America was still relatively small at the time. It's not out of the question that misinformation from them could have been spread. However, here's a promotional item that invited kids to the birthday of the NES console on Wednesday, October 9, 1985. The venue mentioned, Visage, was a nightclub at the time, according to this article from New York Magazine. The toy store that sold the NES console to the original customer number 1, was FAO Schwarz, which is currently owned by Toys R Us. They proudly tell people that they were the store that sold the first NES console, as they went shut up about it during their 150th anniversary celebration, but they don't actually have any record of that transaction. Because FAO Schwarz was one of the few places in New York, or North America really, that you could even purchase an NES console, a number of Nintendo employees were actually present for that first original sale, which included the buyer purchasing all the available games too. Ironically, that first customer is believed to have been a competitor, possibly from Sega, but Sega weren't the only ones preparing to take on Nintendo at the time. Whether Super Mario Bros. Was sold to customer number 1 is inconclusive. It's possible it was sold to him, and it's possible it wasn't. But the irony that Nintendo's first customer was possibly a competitor isn't surprising either. In October of 1985, Sega was just about to challenge Nintendo at the dawn of their North American debut. Sega's SG-1000 gaming system had failed to tackle the Famicom in Japan, but North America was a market where they had high hopes of taking down the unknown Japanese trading card company turned video game giant. Nintendo didn't take Sega very seriously during this time. They thought of them more as an annoying pest rather than a competitor on the same playing field. But this annoying pest refused to concede anything. Instead, Sega just kept getting up after what should have been knockout punch after knockout punch from Nintendo. And to be fair, Nintendo didn't really have a reason to fear Sega. In terms of market share, Sega was barely a blip on Nintendo's radar. From Nintendo's perspective, the competition, or the lack thereof, was not their problem. Their problem was convincing Western consumers that video games were not a fad, and that's exactly where their energy was invested, in advertising and marketing. If you're Sega in this relationship, this situation can be both good and bad. Nintendo was shouldering the bulk of the hard work on the area of convincing Western consumers to invest in newer video game consoles. This scenario can free up a competitor like Sega to focus on development of a better, cheaper system. In a way, Sega needed Nintendo to be successful in North America if they were ever going to stand a chance there themselves. Whether they realized it or not, Sega had taken a page out of Sun Tzu's The Art of War and applied it into their business practices. They weren't the first to do it in a business setting, obviously, but it is something worth noting. Most modern businesses already had applied Sun Tzu's principles for decades before this. Sega was determined to overtake Nintendo, one way or another, but they wanted to be smart about it. In October of 1985, while Nintendo was gearing up for the release of the NES console in North America, Sega released the Mark III in Japan for a price that was just slightly higher than the Famicom. Nintendo had marked the Famicom with a 14,800 yen price tag. Sega was offering the Mark III for a just slightly higher price of 15,000 yen, but the two systems were dramatically different in terms of their technical specifications. Both the Famicom and NES came equipped with 2 kilobytes of onboard RAM. The Mark III came equipped with 8 kilobytes of RAM and 16 kilobytes of VRAM. Sega rebranded the Mark III into the Master System for what would eventually be their North American release in 1986. Sega's strategy was to provide a better system for the same price. While Sega failed to capture both attention and any considerable market share with the Mark III, they weren't quite finished yet. As Nintendo began to quickly become popular in North America throughout 1986 and 87, Sega was already planning their next generation console. They were definitely determined to not repeat the mistakes that both they and other video game manufacturers such as Atari had notoriously made. One of Atari's biggest mistakes that led to the video game crash of 1983 was not developing the next generation consoles. The 5200 was not a next generation console in the same respects that it needed to be. Sega didn't know how long Nintendo's popularity with the Famicom and NES consoles would last, but they knew it wouldn't be forever. Sega realized that without a technical upgrade, Mario could only take Nintendo so far. The Sega Mark III was already 4 times more powerful than the wildly popular Famicom and NES, but it wasn't powerful enough to sway consumers to switch to Sega's library of games. Sega was relying on their R&D department, led by Masami Ishikawa, to develop this next generation console. Ishikawa had joined Sega in 1979 and led the R&D team that designed and developed Sega's Mark I, II, and III consoles. So, he was the natural choice to build the next console for Sega. During development, Ishikawa discovered that not only had Nintendo already started development for the next generation of their console, but that somebody new was jumping into the ring as well. Someone who had been waiting patiently for the right time to finally release what was the most powerful game console of the era. The third generation of gaming consoles was well underway, and with this fourth generation, a battle of the bits was just getting started.
That is bona fide badass.